Halloween, the old Myers place, Chapter 14. Jeff Whalen buzzed down the dirt road on his motor scooter, carrying a bag of milk and a loaf of bread and the rickety wire basket on the handlebars. The holes in his jeans and lightweight windbreaker did nothing to protect him from the biting cold air. His longish blonde hair whipped back out of his eyes, and he couldn't wait to get inside and light a fire in his fireplace. As he approached his house, he saw a gleaming black BMW parked on the gravel. The driver's door was open, illuminating the empty leather-upholstered cab. He parked the scooter and grabbed the bag of groceries carefully. He then moved toward the car and peered around in the darkness for some signs of the owner. He noticed the cemetery gates were cracked open. "Oh, great," he sighed, looking at the personalized license plate of the car that abbreviated "Spoiled Brat." He realized that the car belonged to Shannon Geary, Mary's snobby little friend. What on earth is she doing there, he wondered, remembering that it was Halloween, remembering the old gate creaked warningly in the wind. Jeff peered out into the graveyard and saw it. Oh God, it was there, unmistakably there. A faint flickering light glowed from the middle of the cemetery, just as it had the other night. He'd seen it a few nights ago, tried to warn Mary. He knew the light shone from Judith Myers' grave. Fear flooded through Jeff's body. "Oh no! Oh God, no!" he said. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Jeff dropped the plastic bag and crept past the wrought iron gates, ducking behind tombstones as he moved silently toward the light. Almost against his will, his shaky legs carried him closer and closer. The grinning jack-o'-lantern became visible atop what he knew to be Judith Myers' tombstone. He looked away quickly, trying to understand. He didn't need to look any closer. He knew that someone had just been out there, had lit the candles. Jeff lunged behind a thick tree trunk a few yards away from the stone and tried to catch the breath that wheezed out of his mouth. Shock and terror ripped through his brain. Where was Shannon? Had she done this? Had Michael Myers been here? It didn't make sense. His mind tumbled with fear and confusion. He took a deep breath and forced himself to look at the tombstone, to look at the... Jeff gulped. Lumps on the ground. Jeff screamed out in horror as his numbed body stumbled backward in shock over what he'd just discovered. The thing he hadn't seen a moment ago. The limp bodies of Shannon Geary and Kimmy Harrison were slumped on either side of the tombstone. Two pairs of glassy, cold eyes stared lifelessly at him. Their blood-soaked clothing was barely visible in the dim, flickering candlelight. Even though his mind told him they were dead, he rushed over to the girls and ripped off his jacket. The blonde one was dead for sure. He knew instantly by the sickening pile of glistening intestines that spilled out from her body. But Shannon, oh God! He wrapped his jacket around her shoulders and tried to feel her pulse, some sign of life. Her body was still warm, but collapsed in a heap at his touch. She was dead too. Jeff sprang to his feet, knowing instantly what had happened to them. Who had done this? The name repeated over and over in his mind. Michael Myers. Michael Myers. The boogeyman. Be quiet. Get back to the house, he told himself. The tombstone became a blur and everything was spinning as he ran down the path through the cemetery. Don't look back. Jeff fished out his keys and burst through the door of his house. He picked up the phone to dial the police. The line was dead. Dead, just like the girls. In a panic, he burst out the door and jumped on the scooter. His body was numb with fear. He had to get help. Had to warn everyone. Jeff jammed the key into the ignition of the scooter, which groaned to life with a mechanical rattling sound. A cloud of dust rose up as he disappeared down the road toward town. Jeff cranked the gas handle back as far as it would go. Within minutes, he found himself passing through Haddonfield Estates on the way into town. He remembered that Josh Pender was having a party. Maybe Mary was there. Everyone was there. It would only take another minute to drive by. Instinctively, he veered up the hill to the house. Mary would still be there, and safe, he hoped. Chapter 15. Josh grabbed Mary's wrist again and was drunkenly trying to apologize. He wouldn't let her go. Suddenly, his body was jerked backward toward the ground. He whipped around and snarled grotesquely like a wild animal at the two girls standing above him. Mary instinctively backed away from him and pulled herself up from the ground. She was too angry to cry, too humiliated to yell at him. She just wanted to leave. Michelle's steel-toed boot crushed into Josh's bare chest. "You slime bag!" she screamed. "You freaking slime bag!" "Stop it!" Mary screamed. "Let's just get out of here." Josh spit on the ground and laughed meanly at the two punk girls. He turned and growled at Mary. "Are these your friends? I should have known!" He stood up and gave Mary a hard shove, knocking her to the ground. Jeff Wayland followed the caravan of parked cars leading up to the Pender estate. All was quiet on the street except for the buzz of his scooter. For a moment, the horrifying image of the dead girls was all he could see. He snapped back to present time as a loud scuffle broke out in front of Josh's house. Through the dim light, he saw Mary being knocked to the ground by someone. It was Josh Pender. He was cussing at all the three girls like a madman. Adrenaline pumped through Jeff's body as he jumped off the scooter and let it fall in the middle of the street. He jumped Josh Pender from behind, and the two boys fell to the ground. Jeff wasn't much of a fighter, but he didn't care right now, after everything that had happened. People were dead. Michael Myers was on the loose. Jeff screamed out in pain when Josh kicked him hard in the leg. He had to stop this guy before he really hurt somebody. He had seen Josh's rage before. Mary, Julifer, and Michelle backed away in shock as the boys became a blur of fists and violent blows. The three girls fled down the street. As Mary ran, she wasn't sure who she was more afraid of, Jeff or Josh. Josh's fist pounded into the sore spot he'd created on Jeff's leg. Jeff cried out again, but managed to push Josh over backwards onto the street and pin him down. Jeff raised his fist above Josh's face. "You psycho! What the hell are you doing?" he screamed, his nostrils flaring with rage. Josh struggled to break free of Jeff's surprisingly strong shoulder hold. "Let me go! This is none of your goddamn business, you freak!" he growled. Then Jeff retorted, "Oh yeah? Well, it is my goddamn business when I see you attacking girls." Jeff crushed Josh's shoulders back against the ground. "Is this becoming a hobby of yours? How many other girls have you attacked? Huh? Remember the night at the cemetery? I'll never forget the girl who came pounding on my door. Her dress was half ripped off. You're the freak, Josh." Josh grunted. "I'm not the one who attacked Mary the other night, am I?" Jeff crunched his knee into Josh's bare chest and envisioned his knuckles knocking out Josh's dazzling white teeth. "Maybe it was you who was in her house," Josh said with a sneer, despite the pain that Jeff's weight was causing him. "Or maybe it was Michael Myers. Isn't he your best buddy?" he said. Jeff could barely contain his anger and had to force himself to hold back his clenched fist. "You're crazy, man," he shouted to Josh. Josh spat. "Maybe so, but that's our little secret." Josh suddenly relaxed and smiled as a string of football players jogged down the driveway toward the fight. He whispered, "You'd better run for your life now, freak boy." Josh suddenly turned on the emotion and screamed out to the jocks, "Help! Help me, you guys!" Outnumbered and knowing that the meathead jocks would take Josh's side, Jeff fled down the street. He didn't have time to pick up his scooter. He followed after the girls who were way down the block. Josh shook an accusing finger at Jeff and cracked out orders to the jocks like a drill sergeant. "Get him! God, crush him now!" Jeff glanced back and saw a battalion of football players led by Josh, all stumbling down the street after him. The pain stabbed through his leg as he ran with a limp toward Mary and the two punk girls. Mary spun around and saw Jeff Wayland being chased by Josh and the entire football team. "Oh my God!" she cried. The three girls rounded the corner by a clearing in the woods. Mary grabbed Julifer's pale fingers, which were coated with chipping black nail polish, and pulled her onto the dark forest. Michelle ducked behind a tree. Jeff had lost sight of the girls and knew that he could no longer outrun the jocks, but maybe he could outsmart them. They were closing in on him faster and faster as his body seemed to move in slow motion. He rounded the corner and slipped on the gravel. Michelle jumped out from behind the tree and pulled him back into the darkness. "Oh, no," Mary whispered to Julifer, seeing Jeff Whalen being invited into their safe little haven. "Like, he's crazy, too." "Shh," Julifer motioned. They all stood frozen in fright as the army of jocks ran past their dark hideaway and further down the road. After the jocks had run past them, Michelle giggled and started up a Looney Tunes impersonation. "There, which way did they go, George? Which way did they go?" "Be quiet," Mary hissed. She turned her back disgustedly on Jeff, who was staring at her through pain-racked eyes. When the jocks finally gave up their search and began to wander off, Jeff whispered hysterically, "Mary, your friends are dead. I found them in the graveyard. We've got to get a phone. Got to get help." What? She stammered, not believing what she'd just heard. Jeff slowly repeated himself. "Shannon and Kimmy. They're dead," he croaked. The dark sky seemed to be closing in on Mary. "This isn't happening. This can't be." "It's true," he told her, grabbing her hand. "I found their bodies by Judith's tombstone, and they were all—" Suddenly, looking as if he was going to be sick, he stopped himself from revealing the gruesome details. Mary looked completely freaked out. He wasn't sure she believed him. Mary jerked her hand away free from him. "You're a liar," she spat, her eyes burning. "Like, just get away from me. Leave me alone," she demanded. "Please, Mary. Michael Myers is really back," Jeff whispered. The terrifying memory stuck in his mind. "You've got to believe me. We're all in grave danger. We've got to get help." Mary snarled. "You're the one who needs help. You're the one who left the bracelet in my room, weren't you?" Jeff shook his head in confusion. "What?" "The bracelet?" Mary accused. "I found it tonight, all covered in blood." "Whose blood was it, Jeff? Huh? Don't lie to me." "No, I'd never do something like that." Jeff's eyes were pleading. "Please, Mary, you've got to believe me." Julifer's expression went blank as she listened to their insane conversation. "Michael Myers? People dead? Are you two crazy?" she said. Tears brimmed in Jeff's eyes. "No," he shook his head. "I wish this weren't happening. I wish I could just wake up from this nightmare." He turned to face Mary. "He's after you. I know he is. He was in your room the other night. I saw someone go in your house, and I went in after him. And he knocked me out cold. Remember, Mary? Please!" Mary thought hard, trying to recall the attack. She knew she hadn't hit anyone hard enough to knock him out. Yet Jeff had suffered a concussion. I don't know," Mary cried. "I can't remember it that well." "Think, Mary. Come on," he coaxed. Mary squeezed her eyes shut and remembered the shadows, the snarling noises, how the attacker had seemed to be everywhere, how he had grabbed her ankle after she had pushed him backward. Mary suddenly realized that there had to have been two people in there with her. Jeff couldn't have been the only one, couldn't have been pushing and pulling at the same time. Her eyes became wet with confused, fearful tears. I don't know what to think anymore," she whimpered. "I think I'm going crazy," Jeff whispered. "Michael Myers thinks you've invaded his territory. He must have left the bracelet in your room as a warning. Everyone knows he always comes home before he attacks." His voice trailed off. Mary believed him. She took a long look at his pain-stricken face and knew that he was telling the truth. Maybe it was the tears in his eyes or the way he was pleading with her. A new breed of fear suddenly washed over her. She didn't want to believe that a bloodthirsty ghoul like Michael Myers could possibly exist. Not on this planet. Not in her pleasant little life. But this was all too real. And it was really happening. What about Tanya and Rob? She wondered in terror. Were they dead too? My house, Mary finally stammered. "It's the closet, and I have to warn my parents. Let's go." Michelle and Gillifer looked at each other helplessly and pulled Jeff up from the ground. Gillifer stared at a cut on Jeff's face that he suffered during the fight. "You're bleeding. Are you sure you're okay?" "I have to be. We have to go back there. We don't have a choice," Jeff said, then winced. A sense of responsibility hung over Mary's head, for the four of them. Forcing herself to be strong and to concentrate on getting them all back to safety, she turned to Gillifer and Michelle. "Take off, you guys," she said. Gillifer protested. "No, Mary. You need our help. We want to go with you. We owe you." If you want to help, go home where you'll be safe. Then I won't have to worry about you," Mary said. "All right, but call us as soon as you... Just call us as soon as you can to let us know you're okay. And thanks for getting us out of that jam earlier, cousin." Mary watched the two girls disappear down the road, then looked at Jeff. "Let's go." Jeff stumbled behind Mary down the road toward her house. Chapter 16. Mary and Jeff made their way down the isolated winding road toward her house. The trees in the thick forest swayed and blew in the gusty wind, as if beckoning them to turn back. The clouds broke up a little, and a gleaming full moon shone down from above. Dense carpets of plants and trees grew thickly on both sides of the road, so thickly that the lights of downtown Haddonfield were blocked out. There were no street lights on the little two-lane highway, which forced the group to travel cautiously on the dark shoulder of the road. "It's just another half-mile," Mary said, looking back at Jeff, whose face was screwed up in a grimace of pain. Josh really must have heard him, she thought. "He's out there somewhere," Jeff panted. "We've got to hurry." Mary still didn't know what to think about Jeff Wayland and his wild story. Nonetheless, she wrapped an arm around his shoulder to help him hobble along. "Did you really find bodies in the cemetery?" she asked, not wanting to know the answer. Please tell me this is some kind of prank." "I wish it were," Jeff said, his heart pounding heavily. "But I'm not making this up. You've got to believe me. He's very alive, and he's back." Mary tried to concentrate on getting them back to her house safely, but she couldn't stop thinking about her friends. Her dead friends. Jeff continued. "He's out there somewhere, right now. We don't have much time. God only knows how many others he'll kill before he's stopped." Suddenly there was a crash in the woods not more than 20 yards away. Fear struck through Mary's heart and caused her aching legs to move even faster. "What was that?" Mary cried, pulling on Jeff's arm. Heavy footsteps crackled in the darkness. "I don't know," Jeff said, his voice betraying panic. "Just keep running." The footsteps got closer and closer to the road, and were now just a few paces behind them. "Keep running!" Mary's heart thudded rapidly with fear and exhaustion as her aching legs kept moving. She glanced over her shoulder. Suddenly, a loud crash in the woods filled the air. The footsteps stopped. Mary figured that whoever was chasing them had fallen down on the vine-tangled ground. They kept running. Mary could see her house just around the bend. Right before they crossed the street, the footsteps began crunching again on the leaf-covered ground. Except that now, the footsteps seemed heavier and faster than before. Mary suddenly thought of Michael Myers. The thought made her entire body feel numb. "Cross the street, Jeff!" she screamed. "Mary, wait! It's okay!" Jeff said, placing a hand on her arm. "It's only the neighbor's dog." Mary glanced back, saw that he was right, and sighed with relief. "Well, come on! We have to call the cops!" she said. Jeff tried to catch his breath as Mary struggled to unlock the door. After she finally got it open, she slumped against the wall and wearily pointed to the phone on the table. Jeff picked up the phone and dialed the police. He panted into the receiver. "This is Jeff Wayland. There's been a double murder. Please hurry. The bodies are in the Haddonfield cemetery. I'll meet you there." Mary cautiously watched Jeff as he spoke into the phone. She was certain now that he wasn't the killer. After all, if he was, why would he have called the police? The killer. She still couldn't believe that her friends were dead. Jeff's call to the police confirmed her worst nightmare. He was not fooling around. Jeff told Mary, "Stay here and keep the doors locked. I'm going to the cemetery. I'll be back soon, or I'll send help to make sure you're okay." Mary nodded fearfully. "Can you make it to the cemetery in your condition?" "It's just a few more blocks," he panted. "Wait," Mary said. She opened a closet and pulled out a wooden baseball bat. "You might need this." Chapter 17. The police had already arrived at the cemetery by the time Jeff got there. Blue and red lights from 3 squad cars pulsed throughout the cemetery, and the yellow beams of flashlights shone eerily across the tombstones and ancient trees. When he reached the gate, Jeff instinctively turned away. He didn't know if he could handle seeing the dead bodies again. Jeff set the baseball bat down on the ground and took a deep breath as he stepped through the gates. Jeff approached a fat, balding police chief who was mopping his sweaty head with his sleeve. He tapped him on the shoulder. "I'm Jeff Wayland. I live right over there. I reported the murders." Seeing blood on the teen's face, the chief looked suspiciously at him. "Where are the bodies, son?" he asked. "This way," Jeff said, panting and pointing. "In the middle of the cemetery." The chief and another officer, their guns drawn, followed Jeff's lead as he led them down the path of broken stepping stones into the darkness. The flickering light of the jack-o'-lantern was gone. Jeff figured that the gusty winds must have blown it out. Jeff approached the tombstone and squinted his eyes shut as he stepped in front of it. He didn't think he could stomach seeing the girls again. The horrible mess. "Right there," he directed, then quickly turned away. The officers crept forward and shone their flashlights on Judith's tombstone. The chief cringed at first, thinking he saw blood, but then realized that it was only hardened red wax that had dripped off the grinning mouth of the jack-o'-lantern. Jeff opened one eye and sucked in his breath. "They're gone," he cried. The bodies are gone." The chief grabbed Jeff's shoulder roughly. "Is this your idea of a prank, boy?" Jeff stammered. No. They were right there. 2 girls." He wondered if Kimmy and Shannon had played a trick on him, if they'd just been pretending to be dead. No, he thought, remembering their eyes and the horrible mess. He was sure they had been dead. Jeff spun around in panic and confusion. The chief tightened his grip. "What did you say your name was, boy?" he questioned sharply. "Jeff Wayland, sir." He gulped. Where were the bodies, he wondered. The deputy stared hard at Jeff through slitted eyes. "Say, you're the kid we picked up at the old Myers place a few days ago. You attacked a girl." But you let me go, remember? There were no fingerprints," Jeff reminded him. The chief poked his meaty finger into Jeff's chest. "Maybe you own a pair of gloves," he said. Another officer shouted from below the next row of crumbling tombstones, and then appeared carrying something in his arms. "We found this, Chief! Over there!" he shouted. The officer held up a blood-soaked jacket. Fear flooded through Jeff's body. It was his jacket, the one he draped around the dead girl's shoulders, and it was dripping with sticky red blood. The officer pulled out a wallet from the jacket pocket. "Oh no," Jeff thought, panicking. "When they find my ID, they wouldn't understand." He had to get back to Mary. Without thinking, Jeff bolted away from the police. "Stop him!" the chief bellowed. "Mary, I've got to get to Mary," Jeff thought, "if it's not too late." Chapter 18. The old grandfather clock ticked the seconds away as Mary nervously peered out the front window from behind the curtains. Where was Jeff? Where was the help he'd promised to send? Mary felt like sobbing, like giving up. This had been the worst night of her life. Mary forced herself to be strong. Everything will be okay, she told herself. She was repulsed by her dirty skin. Right now, all she wanted to do was get out of her costume and take a shower. If she could only wash the memories of this horrible night down the drain with the dirt. She went upstairs and washed her face with cold water and a bar of tangerine-scented soap. The cleansing suds felt refreshing as she scrubbed away the remnants of her Halloween makeup. She yanked off her gold coin earrings and threw them to the tiled floor in disgust. She looked at her reflection and barely recognized herself. It was as if she were staring at a stranger, some girl with a really screwed-up life. Everything seemed to be spinning. Nothing made any sense. She choked back a sob and went into her room to get some clean clothes. As Mary pulled open her dresser drawer, she caught a glimpse of something outside. A dark shape moved across her lawn and disappeared beneath the porch, but it was too dark and had been too quick a glimpse to allow her to make out the person's face. Mary silently prayed that it was Jeff. Funny, she thought. Why hasn't he rang the bell yet, or knocked on the front door? Panic flooded through Mary's body again a moment later. She remembered that Jeff had been limping earlier from the wound. The person outside had not been limping. Mary's heart raced as she forced herself to look out the window. Seeing nothing, she opened the window and called down in a shaky voice. "Hello? Is someone out there?" Downstairs from the back door came the sudden, electrifying sound of shattering glass. "Oh no, oh God, no!" she whimpered. Mary could hear a pounding noise, followed by the sound of the back door creaking open. Then came a wild crashing noise from the kitchen, as if the dishes were being pulled out of the cabinets and hurled onto the tile floor. A loud clatter of metallic things clattering on the floor could be heard. Mary remembered that her mom had picked up the freshly sharpened knives this morning. The knives! Oh, please, no, she thought. Heavy footsteps moved across the broken glass with a crunching sound. Barely able to stand, Mary backed into her bedroom closet and closed the door behind herself. The footsteps clunked across the floor downstairs. Michael Myers was in the home. A jolt of shock ripped through her mind as she tried desperately to figure a way to escape. Mary was trapped. There was no way out. She held onto the doorknob in the closet and leaned back in an effort to prevent him from entering. The narrow walls seemed to be closing in on her. Her sweating palms caused her to lose her grasp of the knob and to tumble to the floor among the cardboard boxes. The footsteps moved along the upstairs hall, each one creaking louder. He was approaching her bedroom. Mary felt frozen to the floor. Then she became aware of a draft on her cheek from the space between the floorboards. It was her only chance. She dug her fingers under the loose floorboard and lifted up with all of her strength. A few tiny nails popped out. She tugged harder. The board splintered and jaggedly snapped in half, throwing Mary back against the closet door. The space was just barely big enough to enter. She looked down but could see only black space below. There seemed to be a shaft leading from this floor to the bottom of the house. Her bedroom door slammed open, making her shriek. Seeing no other choice, she lowered her body into the hole. Sticky cobwebs brushed against her dangling legs. She had hung there a moment, grasping the board with her fingers, when suddenly the closet door banged open. Mary looked up through the hole and screamed out in horror when she saw Michael Myers. He snarled down at her like a vicious animal. Remnants of his dead, scarred skin and matted hair stuck out from behind the child's plastic mask. His black jumpsuit was caked with mud and torn, revealing hideously puckered white scar tissue. She squeezed her eyes shut and fell into the darkness of the pit below. In a split second, Mary felt her body crash to the hard, cold ground somewhere beneath her house. She could hear wood splitting above her, and vicious growling and panting as Michael Myers ripped up the floorboards to follow after her. She struggled to pick up her sore body, which was wedged between what felt like two cold, damp walls. In the darkness, she used her hands to grope around, searching for a way out. The crashing from above became louder and more desperate. She felt as if she were going to suffocate. Her muffled cries stopped when she noticed a faint light around a corner. She pulled hard against one wall and squeezed through the thin corridor toward the light. Mary had to duck to avoid hitting her head on the support beams under the house. Her body shook with terror as she inched along. The light was just around the corner. It was just... Mary froze in horror, and her mouth let out a hideous scream. A wave of nausea caused her to collapse to her knees. A bright, grinning jack-o'-lantern cast a dancing light across the twisted faces of Tanya and Rob, whose dead skin was discolored and bruised. Their stiff bodies were sitting upright on a worn sofa. their blackened, blood-caked arms wrapped around one another. Mary let out a horrified scream and became aware that she was kneeling in a pool of blood. There was blood everywhere, sticky red blood on the floor, on their clothes, smeared on the walls. Mary spun around looking for a way to escape from Michael Myers and to get away from the deteriorating corpses of her friends Tanya and Rob. Screams of madness echoed through her head. Mary's body and mind were going completely numb. She knew that she was going to die if she didn't find a way out. Her eyes were fixed upon the grisly, rotting remains of Tanya and Rob as she stumbled backwards. Suddenly, she backed up against something. She looked down at the floor and began screaming uncontrollably. Staring up at her through glassy, dead eyes were Shannon and Kimmy. The flickering light danced across their mutilated, bloodied bodies as if they were broken dolls. She barely heard the loud crash and wild thrashing over the sounds of her own screaming. The noise was coming from the narrow corridor. Michael was down there now, coming to kill her. Mary knew that no one was going to help her now. She backed against the wall and continued to move backward, seeking a way out. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she could barely breathe. She couldn't think as the terror pounded through her veins. "Somebody help me!" she screamed, her head spinning between this twisted reality and some other unimaginable nightmare. Chapter 19. Jeff's lungs felt as if they were on fire as he ran down the road toward Mary's house. There was no time to feel the throbbing pain, no time to think. Just get there, he told himself. His aching legs carried him closer and closer. As he ran, he could only think about Mary and how he had to save her. At that moment, he realized that he was still in love with her. His mind flashed back to the day he broke the relationship off. Why was I so stupid? Why was I so afraid that she'd dump me when school started? He had to save her, had to get to her house before it was too late. As he ran on, he figured out that Mary was Michael Myers' prized prey. All of the others had just been in the way. She was the one he was after. He could see her house now, looming against the eerie black clouds, backlit by the full moon. There were lights on in her house. He could see her bedroom window. Maybe everything is all right, he thought, hopefully. Jeff nearly collapsed from exhaustion when he finally reached Mary's front door. He pounded as hard as he could. There was no answer. He frantically pressed the doorbell and tried to control his rapid breathing. He could hear the bell chiming gaily inside, but nothing else. He pressed his ear up against the door. "Mary, it's Jeff! Open up!" he cried. Still no response. He prayed that he hadn't arrived too late. Jeff sprinted around to the back door and gasped when he saw the broken glass of the window scattered across the steps. "No!" he screamed, his whole life, everything he cared about, seeming, like the glass, to have shattered. Jeff burst through the back door and noticed a set of muddy footprints on the floor, covered with broken glass and crockery. Gleaming kitchen knives were scattered everywhere. He cautiously followed the tracks across the floor and to the staircase. Something had happened in here, something horrible. He was still in the house. The chilling realization hit Jeff when he noticed that there was only one set of footprints, and that they led up the staircase. A mental vision of Mary's sweet face swept through his mind. He had to go up there and face whatever was waiting, even if it cost him his life. Jeff crept up the stairs quietly and cautiously, following the muddy tracks. He stood silently in the upstairs hallway for a moment. There was no noise, not a cry, just dead silence. He pushed open Mary's bedroom door. It creaked. He shut his eyes, afraid of what he might find. A moment later, Jeff forced his fluttering lids to open. There was nothing there. His eyes followed the footprints to the closet door where they ended. His hands were trembling as he reached out to open the closet door. There was nothing in the closet. Nothing but a bunch of old cardboard boxes and clothing strewn all over the floor. It was obvious that there had been an attack, a struggle. But where was Mary? He screamed out, "Mary! Mary!" Jeff stumbled downstairs and spun around, trying to figure out what had happened. Then he heard a noise like a scream. He forced himself to stand still and silent as he tried to detect where the cry had come from. There! He'd heard it again. It was coming from outside somewhere. Jeff unlocked the front door and bolted through the entryway. Where was she? Jeff whirled around in the darkness, listening for the scream again. Mary! Where are you? He cried out into the night. Chapter 20. Under the house, Mary backed out of the chamber of horrors, away from the dead bodies of her friends. She was close to being pushed over the edge of sanity. She felt as if her world was closing in on her, as if her young life was coming to a horrible end. She knew that she would never forget what she'd seen tonight, that the horrible images had settled permanently in her mind. She'd never be the same again, if she lived. Fight back! You've got to stay alive, a voice told her inside. Michael Myers crunched across the dirt floor toward her. She could hear his snarl just around the corner. She could hardly see through the tears that streamed out of her eyes. She suddenly felt lightheaded, as if she were in a dream. Find a weapon, she told herself, suddenly snapped back into reality by her stalker's vicious growling. Mary felt around on the ground, picked up a potato-sized rock, and grasped it in her sweating palm. Just as she was thinking that a rock wouldn't do her any good, his face, shrouded in that sickening white mask, appeared staring at her. He hunched down and stepped closer, breathing deeply, a dry, rotting sound that made Mary's skin crawl. The heat of his heated breath was just feet away. Suddenly, his body lunged toward her. Mary screamed and jumped back a few feet. Her body shook with hysteria. She was backed up against the cold wall. In a blur of motion, Michael Myers jumped forward again. Mary screamed and dodged to the side just as he crashed violently into the far wall, exactly where she'd been standing. Mary dropped the rock when she spotted a 2x4 on the ground. She grabbed the heavy board in a shaking hand and was stunned by the sharp pain that suddenly riveted through her palm. She whimpered and let go of the board. A rusty nail protruded from the end of the wood. Quickly, she picked it up again and swung it around, holding the nail side outward. Michael Myers leapt at her. Using all her strength, she aimed the board at his rotting face, then swung it. With a thickening thwack, the nail sunk into his mask and pinned the board to his forehead. Mary held her breath as a trickle of blood seeped down the plastic mask between the eye holes. He staggered backward. Mary crouched down and ran through the darkness without looking back. "Oh, God, please help me get out of here alive," she told herself. Chapter 21. Jeff stared up at the moon from Mary's front lawn. Where was she? Then he heard her scream again. It was muffled and sounded very far away. He took a few steps toward the house. He heard it again, and this time realized that it was coming from below her house. Jeff remembered that there was a large gap between the house and the ground on the side of it. He crawled into the gap a couple of times when he and his father were working on the plumbing last summer. He had to hurry. As Jeff ran toward the door, he saw Mary's horrified face pressed up against a screened air vent under the house. She was clawing at the metal wire and screaming hysterically. "Help me!" she screamed at Jeff. "He's going to kill me!" The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as he listened to her screaming. He'd never heard anyone scream like that. Jeff shouted back, "I'll be right there! Try to fight him off!" Around the side of the house, Jeff dug at the ground, making a hole large enough for him to crawl through again. Jeff noticed smears of blood and bits of hair and flesh stuck to the frame of the house, which made him reel with nausea. He fought it off, then jumped forward and said a prayer as he entered the gaping hole under the home. Jeff followed Mary's screams through the darkness under the home. The pungent odor of rotten death wafted through the damp crawl space. A sharp pang of terror stabbed through his body when he stumbled across the 4 dead bodies, their faces twisted in hideous, horrified masks of death. He instantly recognized the 2 girls from the cemetery. Their faces and bodies were gashed, and their clothing was soaked in fresh blood. The others had been dead for several days, he estimated, by their severely discolored skin and the sickening smell. "Oh, God," he whispered, forcing himself not to scream. Jeff's throat tightened, and he made himself turn away from the corpses. Somehow his rubbery legs carried him toward Mary. At last he saw her. She was whimpering and still clawing at the tiny screened window. Blood dripped from her raw fingers as she tried to pry the wire mesh out of its cement frame. From out of the shadows, Michael Myers stumbled toward Mary. The filthy, withering flesh of his hand gripped a gleaming butcher knife. "Mary!" Jeff screamed. "Look out!" Jeff's voice having caused her to whip around, she saw that Michael Myers was now just a few feet behind her. She screamed and ducked out of the path of the descending knife. Mary ran to Jeff, and Michael Myers came at them. Jeff ordered her, "Go that way! There's an opening! Run! Run!" Jeff found himself alone with Michael Myers, who was moving toward him. His pasty, rippled skin seemed to glow in the dark. His burning black eyes radiated pure evil. Jeff frantically looked around for something, anything to use as a weapon. But there was nothing but dirt and small rocks. As he backed up, he clunked his skull against something hard on the low ceiling. The rusted plumbing pipe. He and his dad were planning to replace it next weekend. If he could only break a section free. Jeff grabbed onto the middle of a fat pipe and ripped at the part that ran beneath the floor of the home. Using all his strength, he grunted and pulled a long section loose. A hard stream of water burst into his eyes. Jeff screamed from the pain as he grasped the metal pipe in his hands. Michael Myers lunged forward, and Jeff closed his eyes and held out the piece of pipe, its edges sticking out in sharp shards of rusted metal. The weight and force of Michael Myers' own body caused the pipe to drive itself into the center of his chest. A blinding burst of blood and water sprayed hideously onto the floor. Another pipe broke loose and more water spurted out from the ceiling, flooding and pulling across the basement floor. Michael Myers struggled to break free from the pipe that had broken through his weakened ribs. "You should be dead!" Jeff screamed, his dry voice beginning to crack. He rammed the pipe further into Michael Myers' chest until it crunched all the way through his ribs and out his back. Jeff closed his eyes and pushed again, javelining the pipe completely through his body and up against the wall. Michael Myers twitched violently and sank to the wet, muddy floor. Jeff stared at the hideous body of Michael Myers. His eyes, as black as spiders, stared back. Jeff wasn't sure if he was dead, but he didn't want to wait and find out. He put his hands to his face and screamed out into the darkness. "Mary! Are you still in there? Mary! Where are you?" Jeff heard her whimpering and followed the muffled sounds, closing his eyes as he passed the dead bodies. The blood that soaked the ground made a squishing sound whenever his boots touched the floor. He fought another wave of nausea as he smelled the strong, rotten death smell that hung in the thick, damp air. Jeff grabbed the jack-o'-lantern and followed Mary's hysterical cries. Jeff passed the hole, which she had obviously not seen. She had gone the wrong way and was under the other side of the house. Jeff finally found her, clawing at another air vent. "Come on," he shouted. "This way." Her lower arm was covered with blood, and she was in shock. Jeff dragged Mary by the hand toward the opening. Just as they reached it, a tremendous crashing noise broke the silence. A shadow suddenly loomed against the wall, and Michael Myers stumbled out of the darkness, the pipe still all the way through his body. His unearthly, evil voice snarled as he tried to rip the blood-covered pipe out of his chest. Mary screamed, and Jeff pushed her up through the hole. Michael Myers grabbed the pipe with both rotting hands and yanked the metal rod out of his body. He held the long, heavy pipe and struck out at the couple. Jeff dodged the blow, which hammered against the solid ground with an ear-splitting crash. As Michael Myers raced to strike again, he accidentally hit another narrow pipe that ran along the ceiling. A loud hissing filled the air, and the smell of gas began to fill the crawl space. "He broke the gas line!" Jeff screamed in horror. The severe wound in his chest, now gushing with blood, caused Michael Myers to stumble backward. There was no time to waste. Jeff tried to crawl out after Mary, but slipped on the wet ground. Michael Myers began stumbling toward them again, his black eyes as cold as death. The smell of gas was choking. Mary reached down for Jeff's hand, and he managed to pull himself halfway through the opening. Suddenly, a thick hand grabbed onto his ankle. Jeff cried out and kicked his foot backward as hard as he could. Michael Myers fell backward, and Jeff was able to hoist himself out and dive to safety on the muddy lawn. Moments later, the flickering jack-o'-lantern ignited the leaking gas under the house. As Jeff and Mary stumbled away, an earth-shaking explosion knocked them to the ground. A hideous scream filled the air, and flames licked through the screen windows beneath the house. A burning hand reached out of the hole and writhed around. Then the fingers slowly closed and fell back into the darkness below. Chapter 22. Jeff stared at the burning house in horrified fascination. The orange glow of the fire lit up the black sky and the forest surrounding the old Myers place. Jeff wrapped his arms around Mary and hugged her tightly as she sobbed. "It's over, Mary. It's over. He's dead now," Jeff said softly, stroking her tangled hair away from her dirty face. Mary was still too horrified to speak. She nodded her head and continued to sob. As Jeff held her in his arms, he prayed that she'd be okay someday. Given what they'd been through tonight, he tried to imagine the horror she had to be feeling. The whole horrifying experience. All of her best friends were dead. Jeff hugged her closer. Police and fire truck sirens wailed through the air as the emergency vehicles barreled down the road. Neighbors began to cluster in the street and point at the burning house. Mary and Jeff were escorted off the lawn by paramedics. As the paramedics examined Mary, and even when they shined a bright pinpoint light in her eyes, she just stared ahead, still stuck in the nightmare. They wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and began asking her questions, which she did not answer. From somewhere deep down inside, Mary could hear them talking and wanted to answer, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. It had been all too close, too real, but she knew she'd be all right. She made it this far and was still alive. It would just take time. Beneath the trees, behind the house, away from the bright lights, Michael Myers pulled himself up off the ground. He steadied his raspy breathing and lurched away from the flashing sirens and crackling radios. His singed clothes crackled against his burnt skin. The white plastic mask had been melted onto his face in the explosion. He stumbled along, making his way through the woods, carrying himself away from the gathering crowd, but not too far. Okay, this has been the conclusion of Halloween, the Old Myers Place, chapters 14 through 22. Before I get into my opinion on this book, I want to just pretend for just a moment, if you guys can come to Fantasyland with me, and let's pretend that after Michael Myers picked up himself and started walking and steadied his breathing, on his way away from the house, let's just say that he stopped at the party at Josh Pender's house, okay? And at this party, he disemboweled Josh and the football players and strung them up by their innards. Because I'm telling you right now, if anybody deserved to die in this book, it was Josh Pender. And he did not die. His story did not get wrapped up. Sure, he got his butt kind of kicked by Jeff, but really Jeff was worse for wear. You know, the last we saw Josh, he snapped out of his psychoness into his, like, help me, friends, with his football players, and they all went after Jeff. So I'm just going to pretend, after Michael Myers walked away from her house, as the author wrote there at the end, that on his way to wherever he was going, which the next book is The Madhouse, which I've already narrated. Let's say he was going to the old psychiatric hospital. On his way there, he stopped and disemboweled Josh. Is everybody happy with that ending? I am happy with that ending. Other than that big gaping Josh Pender hole in the story, I gotta say I really enjoyed Halloween, the Old Myers Place, and I enjoyed all three of Kelly O'Rourke's Halloween books. I do apologize that I narrated The Madhouse before Old Myers Place. I got mixed up on which one was part 2 and which was part 3, even though on the spine it says 2 and 3, which I didn't notice until halfway through narrating The Madhouse. But now, if you haven't listen to all of them, or even if you have, you can go back and start with the Scream Factory, then listen to this one, and then the Madhouse. And that's the order they go in. Anyways, guys, wow. The Michael scenes were intense tonight. Not a whole lot of death in this book, but the kills that he did do were pretty gruesome. Setting the bodies up like that was pretty crazy. I don't know about him screaming when the explosion went off, but I do know in the first movie he did grunt and kind of growl in some scenes, so I am okay with him growling and snarling whenever he's doing what he's doing. But yeah, guys, let me know in the comment section what you thought of this book and what you thought of the trilogy altogether. Sadly, this is the last of the official original novels based on Michael Myers, but there are 3 novelizations from the movies, part 1, 2, and 4, and I will be doing those in the future. And if there's any fanfic novels that have been written out there, please let me know, and I will look into doing them as well. I know there's a book called The Trial of Michael Myers. If anybody has read that book, it's a fan-made novel called The Trial of Michael Myers. Let me know what you thought of that, and if you think it's worthy of an audiobook narration. And guys, I'm going to be back very soon, and I will be starting on Jason X to the Third Power. It is actually a sequel to Jason X Planet of the Beast. Even though To the Third Power was published 5th and Death Moon was published 4th, Death Moon is a standalone Jason X book, whereas To the Third Power is a sequel to Planet of the Beast, and Planet of the Beast was a sequel to The Experiment, and The Experiment was a sequel to the original Jason X movie and its novelization. Alright guys, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thank you so much for listening, and thank you John Kassir for the awesome Crypt Keeper shout out. That is just the best shout out we've got so far. Yes, I love Kane Hodder. Yes, I love CJ Graham. Yes, I love all the shout outs we've got, but the Crypt Keeper has really inspired me on a lot of what I do on this channel, so it's really awesome to have that. Have a great night, everybody. Also, guys, don't forget to click Michael Myers' face up there above that icon and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Click the bell to be notified of all future uploads. Check out the description for our Facebook, Twitter, and Discord. Also, check out the 2 playlists above. It's the other 2 Halloween books in this trilogy.